afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's webinar on India's transformative labor law reforms. My name is Neeti Sharma, but let's first understand the background of what we are trying to do today. The four labor codes, as we all know, are not just legislative changes. They represent a structural shift in how companies are managing their workforce compliances, employee welfare, and industrial relations. The intent behind these codes is very clear: to simplify the complex regularity environment, promote ease of doing business, and at the same time, strengthen social security and protection for India's vast and diverse workforce. For employers, this transition brings both opportunity and a responsibility. On one hand, there is a great clarity, standardization, and digitization of compliance processes, while on the other hand, companies have to necessarily revisit their existing HR policies, payroll structures, employment contracts, and compliance frameworks to align with the new definitions and requirements, especially around wages, social security contributions, and worker classifications. While on the other hand, for employees, the impact is equally significant. The new framework aims to ensure fair wages, timely payments, expanded social security coverage, including the gig and platform workers, and improved health, safety, and working conditions. This marks a progressive step towards formalization and inclusivity in the labor market. In today's sessions, we will break down these complexities, covering the critical updates across the four labor codes. How do we implement them in wage structures, impact on industrial relations, and the new safety and social security standards? And to help us navigate these discussions, I have with me my senior colleagues, Mr. Bala Subramaniam, Bala as we call him, who's a senior vice president and business head of enterprise staffing. I have also with Dr. Nipun Sharma, CEO of Degree Apprenticeships, and Mr. Sandeep Agarwal, co-founder and director of TeamLease RegTech. So, Bala, let me get started with you. You work with many of the largest organizations in India that employ hundreds and thousands of employees across various industries such as FMCG, telecom, retail, BFSI, and manufacturing. When you talk to them about the labor codes and the transition that's happening, what are you hearing from them as their major concerns right now?
Firstly, thank you so much, Neeti, and good afternoon, everybody who has joined this conversation. So yes, Neeti, over the last couple of weeks, I had the opportunity of meeting at least 24 enterprise customers of ours. And what we are hearing really can be broken down into two parts. It's a mix of clarity-related concerns and real business impact problems. And both are equally important. So I'll start with the clarity bit first. Despite all the conversations which are taking place, there is still a fair bit of uncertainty around when and how this will actually get implemented. The most basic question companies are asking is around the timeline. Is this going live on April 1st? Is it linked to November 21 last year? Or are we looking at yet another deferment? Now, this may sound like a simple question, but for large organizations, it is a big deal. Because any change of this nature requires not only payroll restructuring, you're talking about system-related changes, policy updates, and importantly, communication to employees and making sure that there is a smooth cascading and eventual rollout. And these are not things that you can do overnight. So without a clear timeline, most companies are in a wait, watch, and partially prepare kind of a mode. And closely linked to this is the question of retrospective applicability of the labor codes as well. If certain provisions are interpreted retrospectively, the implications are not just operational, they are financial and substantial at that. So you're suddenly looking at backdated contributions, rework liabilities, and potential balance sheet impact as well. So companies are being cautious and understandably so. They don't want to move too early and get it wrong, but they also don't want to be caught unprepared or underprepared either. That is when the second layer comes in, which is the interpretation part of it. So even within the framework, there are multiple areas where there are several interpretations which exist. The most common ones that keep coming up in conversations are gratuity calculation and leave encashment treatment. Now, the government has provided guidance, but when it gets translated into real-world payroll structures, nuances emerge. Different advisors interpret it slightly differently, and companies are trying to figure out, what is the right way of doing it legally, practically, and is it defensible if questioned. So large organizations, especially listed ones, tend to be conservative. I'm sure most of the audience watching would have taken note of the fact that such large listed companies have already taken massive provisions, primarily towards gratuity and leave encashment liabilities, not even so much towards CTC increase. While that is there, the substantial incremental liability is mostly towards these two items. So these companies would rather take a higher cost and provide for it than take a compliance risk. But they still want clarity before locking things in. So they have this cushion built into the books, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that the implementation is done and dusted. In fact, it's far from it. Now, coming to the second aspect quickly, which is the actual business concern or the impact. The concern is cost. So that's where the conversation becomes very real. Traditionally, many companies have structured the compensation in such a way that basic pay is only 30 to 40% of CTC because they pegged it to gross salary, not really the CTC. That allowed them to optimize statutory contributions while still maintaining a very competitive take-home salary, because that is what prominently stands out for employees, right? So with the new labor code definition, effectively you're talking about 50% of remuneration, which has been standardized now. Just think about what it does. The moment that happens, your contributions towards PF, your gratuity provisioning, and even bonus calculations in some cases, they get impacted. So overall, your statutory outflow would go up. Now, companies are faced with a choice. Either absorb this increased cost or restructure the compensation. But if you restructure in such a way that it reduces the take-home salary, then the employee experience gets impacted. So the only sustainable way is to increase the CTC while protecting the net take-home, but then that has a direct P&L impact. On top of this, there are secondary cost impacts, last but not the least. I already spoke about gratuity and leave encashment, which have become very expensive. And one of the most significant shifts is around how fixed term employment, that is FTE, is treated. That's the single biggest change from a gratuity perspective. Earlier, be it for FTE or for core employees, gratuity would kick in only from 4 years and 8 months of tenure. Now, for FTEs, it kicks in after 1 year. Just literally yesterday, Niti, interestingly, I heard from the CHRO of one of the large companies, in the retail space. They were saying that, this 1 year is applicable only for the first time that a person comes into FTE, not every time. Well, that is new. This is just an exemplar of how there are multiple interpretations which exist. And last week when I was in Delhi, there was this other client who was saying that, hey, for my industry, it doesn't apply. It is still 4 years, 8 months. So people are still figuring things out. And these conversations also have this potential to impact the fundamental economics of how companies think about fixed term hiring versus core and all of that. So we're already seeing early signs of this playing out. So I already spoke about companies taking provisions towards these liabilities. Like I said, the conversation is still not settled, despite taking provisions. So, but then there is a lot of convergence which is happening. Everybody is coming around to thinking that, hey, I cannot really afford to have my employees have a cut in their take-home pay. I mean, it cannot be substantial, it can be marginal, which is okay. And there is a three-way balancing act which happens between cost, compliance, and employee sentiment. And for the bulk of corporate India, this is the increment season as well. Can we use a portion of the budget for increments to make sure that the labor codes related cost impact is absorbed? Yeah. So some of the organizations are also taking a step back and thinking about this from this perspective. Is this the moment for me to take a step back and rethink my entire workforce structure itself? Right. So it's a strategic question. It is not just a point in time transactional way to think about just adjusting your compliances and managing your costs and moving on. For example, fundamental in principle questions like what or who should be full-time versus flexi staff? How do we improve productivity per employee? Are there roles that need to be completely redesigned altogether? Are the questions that are coming up. So very quickly, just to sum up the answer to your question, Niti. Yes, there is concern around timelines and interpretations. Two, yes, there is a very real concern about cost. But beyond that, there is also a much deeper realization that this is not just a compliance change. This is a structural shift in how organizations think about workforce, cost, and productivity important. And that is the direction in which most of the serious conversations are now moving, because this has now been out in the market for about 5 months plus, right? And conversations are evolving in that direction, if that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. And I think this is quite helpful for us to get started Lots of uncertainty, lots of ambiguity. This has a long-term impact, but how do we start work now? When do we start it? When is it applicable? I think there are lots of questions that all of us have in our minds. And you mentioned about the increase in the cost of workforce, and I think that's one hit or one direct impact most employers are seeing as the only way forward, because you can't really reduce your employees net take home absolutely immediately. So to probably get a little more detail on the wage codes that have been identified under the four labor codes, I want to bring in you here, Sandeep, because as we all know that the reforms are not just to make our lives easy, not just to promote ease of doing business, but also to strengthen social security for our workforce. Now, while all of that happens, and while the gig workforce, platform workforce, contractual workforce across sectors are being included, as part of the labor codes, we realize that for employers, this transition is actually very significant. We are moving from a policy phase into an action phase right now. Companies have to navigate the new wage definition. Like Bala said, there is ambiguity on, how do I do it and when do I do it and what do I do. But I think what is required for us to understand is under the wage code or under the new wage definition, what is excluded, what is included. How does a salary not exceed 50% of a total compensation? So from your vantage point, because you really work with many organizations in advising them on the compliance bit on the labor codes, from your vantage point, can you explain to our audience what the new wage definition is and its impact on both the employers as well as employees?
Sure, Niti. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I think will take two separate buckets and discussing. I think one bucket is already indicated by Bala, and what is the intent? The intent is very clear that the base value on which liabilities has to be calculated has to be consistent. And Bala mentioned that over a period of time, this is basic wage only, which is considered by a lot of employers, and there has been inconsistencies on what is the basic. We have companies from 25% of the salary as basic, as well as we have 50% plus also for large corporates who have adopted this wage code long time back. Now, this is the intent that this foundation has to be consistent across, and that's where what the objective was, that bring a particular percentage of overall value of the salary to 50%. Now, we'll talk on this. What is this 50%? And a lot of companies are looking at it differently. If you look at the literal terminology used in the wage definition, it says all remuneration paid either by way of salary allowance or otherwise, whether it is expressed in terms of money or capable of being expressed. Now, if we stick to this definition, and I'll come to what is included, what is not included, it says all money. Now, again, there are confusions because we, as an employer, we end up paying a lot of value to employees. What is very clearly indicated does not come into picture at all for remuneration calculation or wage versus otherwise calculation is your one-time payments. Let's say I'm joining new, there is a joining bonus paid, I'm getting paid a shifting allowance, I have a annual performance incentive payment at the end of the year or once in 6 months. All of this does not get considered at all. And there are complexities around ESOPs as well. Let's say I get ESOP, that is part of my taxable income, whether it is part of my wage or not wage. So very clearly, it has to be not considered at all. It is very clear. Everything that you pay on a month-on-month basis in a layman language becomes eligible for consideration of what becomes eligible for wage and what is outside wages. Now, when we say remuneration, we are very clear that this one-time and annual payments are not considered. Remuneration can be of two buckets: wages, which is included component, and there are other components. When we look at the wage definition, it says ABCD, which is basically your all remuneration paid, blah, 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 and it includes. So a lot of companies get confused here because, and it includes only mention 3 bullet points: basic, DA, retention allowance. A lot of companies now saying, let me ensure that my basic is 50%. Now, is this the correct view? And we'll talk more on this. This is not the correct view. You're saying that this is part of those line items which can be, which should be considered as inclusions. Now, after this bullet points, the law also indicates it does not include. So all the remuneration paid to employees cannot be considered as wages. There are 7-8 bullet points indicated as exclusions. Very clearly indicates A to I under the definition does not get eligible to be considered for wage calculation. So means if you're paying HRA, if you're paying stat bonuses, example, these components should not be considered for your wage calculation or wages, which becomes the basis for your calculation of your statutory liabilities. Now, this catch is here. The paragraph below these exclusions indicate that all the excluded components should not exceed 50% of your remuneration. So it is not saying your basic has to be 50%. It is saying your excluded components cannot be more than 50%. So let us take a small, simple example. In the earlier years, over the period, as Bala mentioned, companies have not been increasing basic. Of course, there is a direct impact on take homes. With the increments, special allowances came into picture, and I kept on adding special allowance as values, and my basic remained the same. So my PF remained the same over the period of time. Now, with a simple example of 100 rupees of salary, which I get from an employer, 50 is my basic, 25 is special allowance, 25 is HRA. Now, what would be the wage in this case? A lot of companies says 50 is the basic, 50 should be the considered basis. This is an incorrect assessment of wage definition. You should simply look at what is the excluded component HRA only in this case. Why? Special allowance cannot get fit into the excluded A to I definitions. And that's where only HRA of 25 rupees becomes exclusion, and the remaining 75 rupees becomes inclusion and indirectly wage, which becomes the basis for calculation of my ESIC, statutory bonuses, my gratuity components. Now, so this is very critical in assessment and understanding of when you restructure salaries, because just simply making your basic as 50% does not help. Because if you end up using another component which does not fit into exclusion bucket, then it is a bigger problem. Authorities at any point of time tomorrow may say this is a wrong assessment. You add this special allowance also into wage, and now your liability goes up significantly, and you might have to actually pay the liabilities backdated as well. Right now, this is one problem statement. Second, we end up paying reimbursement also. Now, this is a tricky area. It is part of my CTC. It is part of my appointment letters. I get this paid every month, but probably at the end of the year or at any point of time, I keep giving vouchers or bills, and then from an income tax purpose, it is exempt, and I don't end up paying income tax on these reimbursement. Now, again, the terminology is used for these reimbursement becomes important, where will you be able to fit into the exclusion bucket? And that's where the assessment and understanding of the exclusion bucket. Most of the line items are very simple and clear when you read A to I in the wage definition. I think a lot of companies and sometimes us as in consultants are also getting confused in one terminology, which has been defined by the law, but no clarity is there. Some paid to employees to defray special expenses. Now, this is one clause, sub-clause under exclusion, which is open-ended, no clarity, no examples, and it is a bit confusing, and we can discuss more later on this. Another problem statement is FAQ. So if you look at FAQs also created confusion. So we'll talk more on that, but in principally, wages has to be looked at as focus more on exclusions and everything else is inclusion. So when you restructure it, don't mindlessly just include 50% as basic, and then you continue like this for the other heads, let's say special allowance. Look at exclusion and then take care of it. The remaining becomes inclusion only. Now, the impact is high. I think some of the impact is very clearly indicated by Bala. Is there are a few benefits to employees, which is possibly a higher payout in terms of gratuity. It is indirectly a negative, which is increased cost to employees as well. There is few negatives to employees as well. High possibility that my in-hand can come down. There is a chance a lot of times if PF is calculated 12%, not restricted to 15,000 or 1,800, then with increased basic, by default, my PF will also increase. So a lot of companies, that's why restructuring in a manner that my basic is not increasing. I'm increasing the other component which gets classified as inclusion. So that is one important way of restructuring, where you don't touch the basic, don't reduce it, keep it as it is, let's say you're using special allowance, increase the special allowance so as to make it at 50%. That is one of the ways of managing your inclusions as well. So I think this is important. I think what's more important for impact perspectives, ESIC now, since the coverage is significantly getting extended, a lot of employees now become eligible, and that's where I think companies are struggling whether to implement ESIC eligibility, register new employees or existing employees for ESIC now, since the salary wage bracket is considered not the gross wages. So that's where I think companies need to be very clear. But I think in a literal simple manner, wage becomes simple. Components is complicated. So I think this is where a lot of companies are struggling also. Which components become exclusion, which components are not exclusions.
Yeah, so Sandeep, thanks, because this is giving us a lot of clarity on what to include and what not to include, or rather what to exclude. But this also means that it would definitely increase the cost for employers. It would also mean that in some cases the net take home for employees comes down. And here is where, Nipun, I would like to bring you in. That you run an apprenticeship program with about 50,000 odd apprentice trainees across various organizations. From your point of view, given that the apprentices are still under the Apprenticeship Act and not with the new labor codes, there is a clear change in the cost and compliance dynamics of full-time hiring. Uh, do you think that we are going to see a lot more apprenticeships being taken in for roles which probably were being taken for core roles? And what kind of shifts are you already seeing when you're talking to your organization partners?
Yeah. Thanks, Niti, and good evening, everyone. Yes, apprenticeships have got a lot of focus, after the implementation of the new labor codes. And from being a supplemental model, they are now becoming a core component of workforce strategy. I think one great thing which has happened is that, under the new labor codes, apprentices are explicitly excluded from the definition of employee. So that has given a lot of clarity and focus. And, three big shifts we are seeing. I think first, Niti, you spoke, Bala, Sandeep, everybody's spoken. First is everybody is looking at the workforce cost structure. So with the implementation of new labor codes, the cost and the complexity of compliances has increased a little bit. And therefore, apprenticeships have come into focus as structured, compliant, and cost-efficient talent pipeline. So this is one big thing. So this has started coming up in conversations at the senior most levels. Secondly, what we are also seeing is that from a hire ready to a build ready shift, which we are seeing. So companies are increasingly thinking that, we should train talent on the job, especially at entry level, rather than only depend on the lateral hiring. And leaders have realized that it is better to train an apprentice for 12 months than to hire a lateral candidate, who might just leave in 3 months' time. So this is the second shift which we are seeing. Third thing is that when we meet clients, earlier our definition of perception, if anybody was to ask who's an apprentice, we would visualize somebody who was in a blue overalls working on a factory floor. So I think that has changed quite a bit. And now, CHROs, HR heads, TA heads, they are seeing apprentices being, integrated into mainstream workforce planning. And this is across functions and locations. So whether you are an old economy company, manufacturing lathes, or you are a GCC, everybody has started looking at as apprentices. And whether it is only the manufacturing, function, or today, you have apprentices in customer services, HR, backend, sales, everywhere. So the conversation has moved from should we use apprentices to that how fast can we scale the apprenticeship model. And this is something, which has helped, people think about that, how apprentices are becoming a strategic entry-level talent engine. So this is the big shift which we are seeing, Niti, when we are going to our clients.
Yeah, thanks, Nipun. And I think it's rightly so. So wherever possible, organizations will look at bringing in more apprentice trainees. Not in terms of replacing workforce, but I think it's an addition to the workforce and preparing for the future of employment. But before I bring Sandeep in on my next related question, we are seeing a lot of you writing your, typing your questions onto the chat box. Please continue doing so. We will respond to all your questions towards the end of the session. So, whatever queries you have, please keep putting in there, and we will close it at the end of our session. Sandeep, Nipun did mention about the advantages of bringing in apprentices. But at what point, and obviously there's a clear cost advantage of bringing in apprentices or contract workforce for organizations. At what point does optimization become a compliance risk? And how should companies draw that line? How much of apprentices, how many of contract workers, and how many, full-time employees?
So, at what line is a difficult question, but I think the optimization initiative becomes a compliance risk when the pursuit for cost efficiency crosses a threshold. And when you cross it, you may end up violating labor laws, you may actually misclassify workers, you may compromise on working and safety and training standards. So if you pick up some examples of what can be a risk while optimizing cost, is when you end up hiring independent contract employees and deploy them on core jobs. Now that is a very tricky area because segregation or distinction between core and non-core in a lot of companies today is very blurred. So that is one area where companies have to ensure that they have defined core activities very clearly, and any support functions or any contract employees are only deployed in support functions and that is non-core activities. We spoke on apprentice. Nitin mentioned about it. A lot of companies are actually using apprentices as cheap laborers, and they try to fill permanent job profiles using that instead of ensuring training, or you ended up exceeding the mandatory hour limits for that. So that is another area where the apprenticeship programs have to be very clearly defined, where you have ensured that it is not a simple fulfilling of a position. You have to have a process to ensure that they have a registered contracts, they have a clear training plans, you have mentors available and designated to them. So it becomes a structured program rather than basically fulfilling open positions. And one more area where sometimes to avoid spending money, you end up ensuring that you have hired contractors and now the contractors become responsible for compliance. I don't end up looking at it. Although in the past also the CLRA Act mentioned that principal employer becomes responsible for all the compliances, a lot of companies do not have enough processes or checks and balances built to ensure obtaining the right set of information from the contractors and validating it. So that becomes an area where employers have to ensure that they have the right processes built in, so that all the compliances required by contractors are being reviewed, monitored, and ensured that if non-compliances are flagged, regular or routine non-compliance contractors have been blacklisted. Otherwise, it's a matter of time, and these strict requirements actually becomes more costly to handle at some point of time. Another thing that companies should think of today is adoption of technology. I think that is very important. Whether you're looking at apprentice, there are technologies which can actually help you monitor apprentice training hours, or it is contractors, there are platforms which can actually support employers into end-to-end contract compliance management, where a lot of things that contractor has to manage, being a very small player and with limited skill set and bandwidth, if the employers support them and getting things done automatically at a click of a button, that becomes easy way to manage the regulations, and you end up still optimizing the cost but not standing at a risk. These are a few examples which employers should look at.
Sure, definitely. And Bala, Sandeep did mention about defining core and non-core jobs to be able to decide where you bring in apprentices, where you bring in contract workforce, and where do you bring in, direct employees. In your view, what aspects of the core versus non-core are needed to be kept in mind, given the implementation of the four labor codes? And do you see any shift for contractual employees from your customer side?
Yeah, I don't know why I'm the one who's getting all the controversial questions, but yeah, I'll try to do justice to this basis, the discussions we've been having weekly. See, this whole discussion around core versus non-core has been going on even since before the labor codes. It's as old as time. And it's just become much sharper now. And I would say it's become a much more strategic call now than it used to be, because it's defined much sharper now. Hence, there isn't a whole lot open to interpretation, unlike some of the other implications called out by labor codes. So earlier, the definitions were somewhat fluid. Different companies interpreted it differently, and enforcement was also not very consistent. It was more based on convenience. Now, with clearer direction, roles which are linked to revenue, customer outcomes, or intellectual property should be treated as core. And companies are being forced to take a much more deliberate view on things like this. But the interesting part is, while the definition is becoming clearer, the decision making is becoming much more complex because, like I said earlier, this whole workforce design has become a strategic area of revisiting triggered by labor codes. So when you actually start applying this role by role, you realize that it's not always black and white. For example, a role may not directly generate revenue, but it may significantly influence customer experience. So how could you say it is not actually impacting customer revenue? It probably does in its own little way. A support function may not be core in the traditional sense, but it is critical for operational continuity. Right? So companies are now having to go much deeper and ask questions like, what truly drives value in our business? What is differentiating for us from the crowd? Where do we want control versus flexibility? So what we are seeing on the ground is not a sort of single shift, it's not black and white, but it's two parallel movements really. First, there is a selective insourcing of roles that are clearly core for sure, where companies feel that there is absolutely no, two ways about it. It is smack dab in one end of the spectrum where it directly impacts revenue, where it absolutely owns customer relationships, or it is directly linked to their IP. So they are saying, you know what, let's move this in-house and let's not take any risks. So that is one. But at the same time, there is also a very conscious effort to optimize everything around the core. So for example, there were a lot of core adjacent roles, which are actually much higher in number than the core roles themselves. And those are being re-evaluated. So these are roles which support the core, enable the core, but are not the core by itself. Right? So here, companies are interestingly increasingly more open to outsourcing through third-party payroll models, managed services, or let me say enabled services, or even outcome-based engagements. So what is emerging is not really a binary model, but there is a layered workforce architecture. In the sense, it's more like a spectrum now. It's not binary at all. So at the center, you have a very small tight core, and there is high control on that. And then around that, there is a concentric circle with core adjacent roles, which are flexible. They can be structured a little differently, incentivized a little differently, and productivity measures are also very different here. And then clearly there are these non-core roles, which are absolutely externalized. So from 2, it is definitely 3, which is core adjacent and non-core. This could evolve into 5 or 7 or 10 as well, right? It's just that there are many more slices of the cassata which are emerging now.
As you mentioned, that most of the organizations are now relooking at their organization structures for the future. Do you see them redefining the core and non-core as they go along?
Redefining, it is redesigning that is happening now. And that redesigning is leading to redefining of these roles as well. But honestly speaking, I don't really see this leading to a reduction in contract hiring. If anything, in fact, companies continue to value flexibility even more now. Scalability and speed to market, that's become much more important now. So what is changing is how exactly they are approaching it. So there is a lot more focus now, Niti, on role clarity, documentation of said roles, how exactly roles are being evaluated, structuring the tenure for people in a certain role, and importantly, how defensible your compliance ecosystem is. So earlier, for example, contract workforce was sometimes used more as a cost lever, right? But now it's becoming much more strategic, but with tighter governance. Yeah. So it's cost or labor arbitrage was what was driving contract staffing once upon a time. Absolutely not the case right now. So companies are asking questions like, can I really justify why this role is external? Is the structure compliant to the core? Will this stand scrutiny if it is tested? Right. So if I have to again summarize this really quickly, this is absolutely not a move away from contract workforce. Like I said, this is a strategic way of redesigning your workforce, and we are moving towards a much more thoughtful, more structured, and a much more defensible use of contract / flexi staffing models. And at the same time, companies are becoming a lot more deliberate about what they consider truly core to their business. So for all you know, it could become a very, very tight core with several layers around it, much like the earth, right? I mean, when I grew up, there used to be just crust, mantle, and core. But now, if I look at my kids' textbook, there is an outer core, there is an inner core. I don't know when they found that, but there are things like that. So we just feel that there is going to be a lot more layers to how companies are looking at their work.
Yeah. So, and Sandeep, with this whole redesigning and redefining of organizations, what are the top 2 to 3 gray areas in the new codes where we still see some uncertainty, or companies are trying to take very divergent interpretations? I mean, Bala mentioned about one such case saying it's only going to be 1 year and not, you're the first time you're an FTC, you pay the gratuity and you don't pay it, perpetually. The different interpretations. But apart from that, what do you see where there's a lot of uncertainty and needs clarity, and multiple interpretations going around in the market within the codes?
So there are many. Now, when anything new comes up and you get into implementation, then you come across a lot of questions. If you look at the simplest one, could be we spoke on the wages. Wage definition, implementation, wage structure itself is a complicated and an area which a lot of companies are looking at it differently or interpreting differently. One major reason for this different thought process was the FAQ issued by ministry, which was first one where they mentioned as an example, all allowances are considered. Now that becomes the very simple way of managing it as per the FAQ. Basic is 50%, HRA plus all allowance becomes the remaining 50%, and norms are sorted. But then questions got asked whether certain set of allowances can be considered as per the definition, and that's where there were brainstormings. And if we have to look at whether it get challenged by the department and if it goes to labor courts or higher courts, will the FAQ stand a chance, or it will be the literal meaning of the definition within the code itself? And that's where I think that this is a gray area of what is exclusion, inclusion. Still, a lot of companies are getting questions by their board members. So why are you considering this? Because it has a direct impact on your cost and the take homes. So, HR gets too many queries if it gets implemented in one fashion and the employees gets impacted. So I think that there are a lot of ifs and buts have to be managed by HR folks while implementing the new wage code. That is one. Second area, we spoke on core versus non-core, but there is another confusion where employee versus worker. Employee versus worker again is another problem statement, which earlier was very simple thought process from a layman language. Anybody in a blue collar is a worker. Or there can be some thresholds on salary. Anything below this salary threshold becomes a worker, which is on ground. Now, the new definition of worker in the code simply indicates anybody who does not have a managerial capacity or a supervisor with X salary or lesser salary. So now the problem statement is it is made it so open-ended that probably a accounts guy who does not, or anybody who is an independent contributor can become a worker because he does not have a managerial capacity. Now it has a lot of impacts because anybody who is a worker can become a part of the union. Now, can the corporate office guys become a part of the union? Can the finance guys become a part of the union? A IT company, there are tons and tons of lower bracket salary guys or coders. Will they be part of worker category? Now, that is another bigger gray area, which everybody is looking at some clarification from government on how do we interpret it, because it becomes very difficult. Now, if I have to manage this, somewhere I have to justify why this is an employee or one person is an employee rather than a worker. And today, there is no simple way looking at just the plain reading of the language, right? Second important area where it is gray at this point of time, it's not clear at all. And there are many other ways. I mean, there is a section called section 124, which indicates that if you are providing certain set of benefits, just because if you have to implement labor code, you cannot reduce that benefits passed on to the employees earlier. Simple example, if a company has a policy which was giving more than 30 days of leave, so I can accumulate more than 30. I have companies who have accumulated 300 days of leave. I have never seen in my life. Would have been happy if I am part of that organization. Now they are saying, now since all other costs are increasing, can I bring down this 300 to 30? Now it is a gray area. You are providing better benefits. Now, in order to implement wage code, you are reducing that benefits. Will it be challenged by the law is a question. So, I mean, these are things which everybody is thinking that will evolve. There will be litigations, there will be court cases, and possibly at some point of time in future, either ministry gives clear guidelines or there will be cases which will define the standing on certain areas.
I think what you mentioned is very critical, Sandeep. How do you balance compliance versus being employee friendly and continuing to give them the benefits that we've given them? And though the core intent of the labor codes is to make life easy and better for the employer as well as employee, but right now it just seems that we haven't found the right answers. There's so many questions in our minds, and unless and until, like you're saying, I think unless we live the 1 year cycle of implementation or more, probably will not have answers to many of those questions.
Absolutely, we will not have answers to most of the questions.
Most of the questions, and I think that's what it's seeming like, right? Nipun, if you had to audit a company's apprenticeship program, because so much of ambiguity and uncertainty amongst the codes,
Yeah.
what are the first three things you would check for compliance gaps from an apprenticeship point of view?
All right. That's a good question, Niti. See, first of all, we have to understand that we have the Apprenticeship Act 1961, and we have to see the both letter and the spirit. Sandeep spoke about it. The first thing is that the Act is very clear that any organization with more than 30 employees, whether it is full-time or contractual, they have to be in the range starting from 2.5% of their workforce. And there's a maximum limit also of 15%, except for Maharashtra where it is 25%. So the organizations have to be mindful of both the things. And secondly is, it is not that it is only at one point in time in a year that, you have to maintain that range. It has to be done in a, meaningful and sustained manner throughout the year. So that is very, very clear. So that is first thing, everybody needs to be cognizant of. Second is that I think Sandeep briefly touched upon it, that all apprentices roles should be mapped to notified trades or optional trades available. Now, and these are available on the government portals. So sometimes people are just not aware about these things, and Sandeep is an expert. He's spoken about it, but people just substitute apprentices for cheap labor, and then they get into all kinds of problems. So one has to ensure that the programs remain structured and outcome driven, and they're aligned to the national skill standards. So all experiences role have to be mapped to the officially notified trades or occupations available on government portals. So this is something very, very important. A lot of people don't pay attention to it, and then they get into challenges. So the third one is that again Sandeep spoke a little bit about it, that we have to focus a lot on the record keeping and audit readiness, and I think that is where we also come into play. The organization is supposed to maintain robust records of attendance, stipend payments, record of progress, work diaries, and all life cycle events, whether onboarding, dropouts, extensions, completions, certificate of participation, assessment certificates. They all have to be done and updated in a timely manner. And in a lot of cases, Niti, a lot of organizations also opt for the government subsidies. For example, in NAPS, you get 1,500 rupees DBT direct to the candidate, or under NATS, 4,500 rupees is going as a DBT to the apprentice. So this is taxpayers' money, right? So and this is being given by the government to promote employability. So therefore, this documentation is very, very important to maintain, and it has to be in line with the guidelines on the government portal. And in a lot of cases, they have to be uploaded on the government portals, so that at any point in time, we, as a government, as a society, as an employer, are answerable to the taxpayer and the regulator, that we are in compliance with all these activities. And therefore, one more thing which we are trying to do is that one feedback which we have got is that the moment we bundle in education, with apprenticeship, which is essentially learning while earning, we see a tremendous improvement in productivity, in attrition, in productivity, in people looking up to their career pathways in the organization. And there again, we have to partner with recognized institutions. So in 6 to 12 months, an apprentice can get a certificate. In 24 months, she can get a diploma. But that diploma has to be from a recognized UGC university, or has to be from a sector skill council, which the government has authorized. And the curriculum has to be designed, co-designed with them. And in 3 years, in the latest amendments which came in September, Now the degree apprenticeship is also recognized by the government. So in 36 months, a person can get a degree also. So these are stackable. And again, when we are partnering as organizations, it is very, very critical that we ensure that whomever we are partnering with for these learning outcomes, of which there are tremendous benefits, they are all in compliance.
Sure.
So this is something we should broadly look at.
And very critical to ensure that not only are we building workforce for the future by bringing in more apprentices, but also staying compliant to the various schemes that the Government of India has actually introduced for apprenticeship programs.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And Bala, from a contractual staffing or from your customer perspective, what do you think is that one risk or shift that under the labor codes leadership teams are still underestimating today?
I'm not sure if my answer is going to be along expected lines, because I think as far as the larger companies as part of India Incorporated are concerned, I believe they're spending a lot of time just thinking about cost impact and compliance risk, and that is understandable. And I believe that those are getting overestimated, not really underestimated. What is really being underestimated is, in my view, the structural simplification that these labor codes are trying to bring in, Aniti, and that is something companies don't seem to realize fully. Let me explain this. Today, the compliance landscape in India is extremely fragmented, and I'm sure Sandeep knows this much better than I do. We are dealing with 1,436 provisions, 181 forms, 84 registers, and 31 returns and multiple other registrations. For any large organization operating across states, this is not just about compliance, it becomes a significant operational burden. So you need multiple teams just to manage all of these things. Now compare that with where we are headed. Imagine this: one system that is able to do a single registration, a single license, and a unified electronic return process. That's a very, very different, fundamentally different operating model. Now, the immediate impact of this is efficiency. Now, you free up a huge amount of bandwidth and overheads within organizations. Teams that were earlier spending meaningless time managing compliance, mechanics, etc., can now just focus on workforce productivity, planning, and delivering business outcomes. You also get much higher transparency and consistency, which reduces interpretation risk, etc., and all over time. So, are we there yet? Absolutely not. But this is the whole goal, the end game for labor codes. If 2944 to 29 to 4 labor codes and subsuming all of these into these labor codes should deliver the outcome in terms of being able to structurally digitalize, simplify, and unify all of the compliances that companies have to do, right? So this is the structural shift that companies are underestimating the impact of. See, in India, there is an incentive for informality. India has just 800 odd companies, which are the very large enterprise category, which is 1,000 crores plus in revenue. But in total, we have 6 crore enterprises, 6 crore registered companies for 150 crore population. Why? It doesn't make any sense, because companies are often incentivized to stay small, because you can stay below certain thresholds. You can operate in less formal structures, because once you meet those thresholds, then there is a host of compliances, the web of which you will fall under. And because of that, the burden just increases sharply, which is fine, because SMEs form the backbone of even developed economies, not just developing economies. So we need to make it easier for them to operate. But that doesn't mean you overburden the larger companies, right? Because if you discourage scale, the problem is the larger formal companies are the ones that drive productivity. They are the ones that create stable employment, and they are the ones who ultimately lead to long-term increase in real wages, right? So it has to make things easier for larger companies to operate. And that is the direction in which we are headed, which can really be a major unlock in terms of our productivity, hence our GDP per capita, hence real income per capita. This is one impact from the corporate standpoint.
So if I may interrupt, and what I'm hearing you say, Bala, is that most companies are underestimating the overall impact of the labor code implementation, and along with that, the overall effort that is required to implement the labor codes and stay compliant?
Oh,
So
absolutely.
the quantum of the impact as well as the amount of work that will go to actually make you make them compliant to the labor codes, right? I think these are the two things that you're really calling out
Yeah.
that people are underestimating.
Shift slash burden is what companies are looking at. Why don't we for a moment step back and look at the long-term benign impact of this, right? And that's on one side, maybe. On the other side, the impact it can have and will have on workforce formalization. So if you look at where we went from a formal employment perspective, pre-COVID, we had roughly 4 crore EPFO contributors, and today we have 8 crore EPFO contributors,
Yeah.
which is the full workforce. It's doubled basically in a span of less than a decade. And obviously, the overall workforce has not. So the pace of formalization is already 10x of the pace of growth in the overall workforce itself, which means labor codes can and will act as a tremendous accelerator in further catalyzing this trend, right? So once you simplify compliance, digitalize all the processes, and make the system much more transparent, it becomes easier and more attractive for companies to operate formally, even if they are small in scale, rather than informally. So in that sense, this is not just a compliance shift or a reform; they are a formalization catalyst for the larger workforce in India. If they are implemented well, they start to correct the imbalance between scale and compliance. These are right now treated as indirectly proportional to each other. So they reduce the friction which is associated with being large and compliant. And when that happens, scaling up becomes so much easier. It becomes frictionless. So that is, I think, what we need to really focus on at this point.
Focus on, yeah. No, absolutely right. And as you were speaking, Bala, I'm saying there's so many questions about inclusions and exclusions on the wages. How do organizations stay compliant? And we would love to spend time on a lot of these questions that have come in from our audience. But before we take the questions, a quick 30-second rapid fire to all three of you is that if you have to give one piece of advice to CHROs and business leaders on navigating the labor codes without slowing down the business and their hiring agility, what would it be? Quick round with all of you. Maybe Bala, you can get started, and then Nipun and Sandeep.
What should my ideal workforce mix look like? How do I balance cost with flexibility? Where do I need control and where can I build flexibility? Those are the questions they should be asking. Second thing, don't wait for perfect clarity. It is okay. Clarity will evolve over time. The companies that are already running different scenarios, stress testing their wage structures and re-evaluating workforce models, they are the ones who will move faster when the switch actually happens. So you cannot really go from a standing start to where you should be. So aim for a flying start. Just put certain things in motion where you at least have 80% clarity. It is okay. Things that evolve. And finally, be very deliberate about partnerships, be it staffing partners or apprenticeships or compliance support. This is not something that can be managed in isolation. You really need to work with partners who don't just understand this, but partners who are really ahead of the curve, who really understand regulations and even help drive the ethos of regulations, and those who can execute at scale at a national level and who can stand by those structures being a true partner when they are being put in place and help you create that defensibility. So very quick one-line summary, Niti. Companies that will come out ahead are not the ones who react the fastest. They are the ones who use this moment to thoroughly redesign how work gets done and choose the right partners who can stand them in good stead.
Nipun?
Yeah. So earlier we are, we are in Bangalore, and here, the founders would ask VCs, do you want growth or profitability? And the conversation last couple of years is we want both growth and profitability. So similarly, compliance and agility are not trade-off, so both can be done together. And I think as my colleagues have been saying, that we need to just think that how do we design a flexible workforce model and not put add-ons at a later stage. So there is a very critical role of permanent employees. There's a very critical role of contract employees. And the smarter companies are now also having apprenticeship bundled in as to have an integrated model. And we started with clients who just for compliance started with 2.5%. And they saw the benefits, and today they are hitting the 15% limit. So, partner with experts, and these are tremendous opportunities to do first principles thinking and redesign your workforce model.
Thanks, Nipun. Sandeep?
My one simple line or advice is simply embed compliance into hiring process, right? Compliance by design is, I think, is something which the companies have to think through to implement proactively. This will minimize the legal risk and the overall manual interventions. How do you define or design compliance? Compliance by design is basically integrate your compliance programs into your hiring systems, HR systems, workflows, and deployment of more and more technology around overall HRMS processes and the compliance processes. So it's a long term. You build compliant frameworks once, and then you continue to do what you're doing for years.
Absolutely. I think incidentally, all three of you all said the same thing. Structural design, integrated, and obviously there is no trade-off between hiring agility and compliance. We need both. So thank you so much, Bala, Nipun, and Sandeep.